animal, not vegetable. In response to the endless cruelties I have outlined in this book, the obstinate meat-eater has one last recourse, and that is to maintain that other animals simply are unworthy of life. There is just something about the nature of other animals, that is, that renders them forever undeserving of our respect. It is this which permits us to go on killing them in the countless billions, not merely today or tomorrow, but for all eternity. Can the vegan offer a convincing reply to such a view? So far in this work, I have been edging around the elephant in the room, which is the question of what an elephant is. When we talk about animals, what do we actually mean? To ask what animals are is to inquire into ontology, the branch of philosophy that inquires into the whatness of things, or what makes something the sort of thing that it is. What makes dandelions, say, different from lions, or my friend Gerald different from my geranium? The answers we give to such questions have important ethical implications. It's fine for me to throw away an old rug, say, but not an elderly parent. And that's because a rug, unlike an aging relative, is not the kind of entity that can take an interest in not being put in a dumpster. If we are to arrive at a plausible account of our moral duties towards our fellow beings, then we first need to know how they differ from other kinds of entities. One reason why arguments over animal rights and the animal economy often seem to get nowhere is because vegans and meat-eaters set out from different starting points concerning the ontology of animals, and so end up talking past one another. Michael Pollan sums up these opposite starting points when he poses the question, the pig or pig? That is, are pigs and other animals unique individuals, deserving of our respect? Or are they mere instances of an eternal, faceless type, pig, hence interchangeable? If animals are individual someones, then we might hold killing them to be wrong. However, if we determine them to be all alike, then killing them is no different than knocking down metal ducks in a shooting gallery. Knock down one target, and an identical one pops up to take its place. No harm can be said to be done, that is, because there is no one being harmed. Hence Derek Jensen's remark that while humans hunted the sea birds known as great auks for numerous generations, they did so without causing appreciable harm to the birds. Though millions of the animals died violently at human hands, none were harmed, because the species was not exterminated outright. This distinction between the uppercase and lowercase animal, pig versus the pig, auk versus the auk, surfaces often in the discourses of hunters and critics defending the meat economy. Before I began to hunt, writes journalist-turned-hunter Lily McCullough, I thought of animals as individuals, with families and emotions and a whole slew of anthropomorphic traits. This strikes me as the environmentalist, vegetarian animal lover's approach. Any death of any individual being is painful and bad. Today, though, McCullough sees her old views as childish. She views other animals now not as individuals but as replenishable stock and kills them with pleasure. Which is it, then, pig or the pig? Why animals are not plants? Sorting out what animals are from our stories and representations about animals can be difficult. The figure of the animal is probably the oldest, most complex symbol in human culture. Early cave drawings of horses, owls, bears, panthers, and others speak to the outsized role that other animals have played in the collective imaginary of our species from the start, as powerful spiritual emissaries and peers on one side, and as prey on the other. As we've grown more distant from nature, however, animals have lost much of their former mystery and power. Held captive on squalid industrial farms, or reduced to objects of public display in zoos, animals today have an abject status. The animals we are most likely to encounter in daily life are either the ones on our dinner plates or the ersatz animals of consumer culture, dancing penguins and singing lion kings. In this hall of mirrors, we seem to encounter only reflections of ourselves, never the animals themselves. So diverse and contradictory are our representations of animals that we may indeed come to doubt that animals are anything determinate at all, seeing them as blank screens upon which to project our own meanings. Neither persons nor things. Animals both exist and don't exist at the same time, like Schrödinger's cat. Like subatomic particles, said to assume a definite position only at the moment of observation, animals come to resemble a cloud of probabilities, with the figure of the animal occupying every possible cultural position at once, until the moment we fix some definite purpose upon it. We treat this kind of animal as meat, therefore it must be meat. We treat this kind of animal as a family companion, therefore it must be worth treating as a family companion. Beneath this seeming indeterminacy, however, lies a rather more definite and prejudicial view of other beings. On this view, every animal is like every other, a timeless copy of an original forged by nature long ago. Animals come into the world with their repertoire of behaviors intact. Programmed by DNA and driven blindly by instinct and desire, animals are flotsam tossed on the sea of existence. Hobbled by primitive brains, they approach the threshold of intelligence without ever crossing over it. Though animals exhibit emotions, these are but crudely developed. Unable to recollect a past or to anticipate a future, they remain prisoners of time, trapped in an eternal now. Life for animals in the state of nature is, as Thomas Hobbes described it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Lacking awareness of death, they cannot fear it. Animals are born, they struggle for survival, they die, that's all. And since every pig or chicken is like every other, their lives can be swapped out or exchanged without any loss, whether to nature or to our own moral sensibilities. The trouble with this view, the sediment of centuries of archaic belief, is that it happens not to be true. Our fellow beings aren't instinctual machines, mindlessly enacting the scripts of their DNA. They aren't all the same, and they don't live in a perpetual now. Nor are they insensible to death. They fear it and do everything they can to avoid it. We nevertheless persist in viewing other animals as so far beneath us as to be virtually indistinguishable from insentient organisms like plants. What about plants? Is indeed one of the first things the skeptical meat-eater asks the vegan. Since all life requires death, the reasoning goes, it makes no difference whether we get our sustenance from animals or from plants, since both involve the taking of life. Vegans are therefore revealed to be hypocrites and sentimentalists. Writer Barbara Kingsolver takes this position in Animal, Vegetable, Miracle, asking rhetorically, who among us has never killed living creatures on purpose? Kingsolver mocks vegetarians, as we saw, for objecting when farmers cut off the heads of crops that blink their beady eyes, but not when they cut the heads off lettuces, comparing the killing of animals to picking apples off trees, or even killing bacteria. When a child is sick with an infection, we rush for the medicine spoon, she writes, committing an eager and purposeful streptococcus massacre. In other words, killing plants, killing animals, killing germs, it's all the same thing. But of course, it's not the same thing. Cutting the head off a mammal or bird can no more be said to resemble picking apples, or cutting lettuces than strangling an infant can be said to resemble wringing out the laundry or squeezing lemons to make lemonade. And to suggest that it is the same thing is to deliberately engage in a fallacious type of reasoning called a category mistake. Category errors occur when we mistake one type of entity for another. Nonsense statements like, "The sofa is sad," or "My zinnias have been thinking about umbrellas again," are category errors because neither furniture nor plants are the kinds of entities capable of having thoughts or feelings. When Kingsolver compares decapitating birds to harvesting lettuces, or describes goats as four-legged tools, or when poultry industry scientists call chickens egg-laying machines, they too are committing category errors. Even very young children understand that animals and plants, sentient and insentient entities, are different kinds of beings. Other species, too, grasp the distinction. If a cat should appear in my yard, the squirrels and birds become suddenly watchful of him, while paying no heed to the swaying tree branches, the falling leaves, or the parked cars nearby. Octopuses disguise themselves most often as insentient nature, as kelp, coral, or rocks, to avoid being perceived as conscious prey. Just how we and other animals are able to recognize one another is something of a mystery. Aristotle, however, believed that it had something to do with the fact that we and other sentient beings share an animal soul, what the philosopher Joel Sachs describes as that inward depth of life that opens in perception. Sachs writes, "If a bird lands on a branch near us and cocks its head in our direction, chances are we will smile and say hello." This is sometimes described dismissively as anthropomorphism, but is it not possible that this unguarded encounter might be of a more original significance? Might not the bird be one of many mirrors in and through which I begin to encounter myself? This is not an occasion of certainty or clarity, of deduction or hypothesis, but of an obscure inner accord. I see the bird see me. I believe the bird perceives me, not because I have a theory to explain it, but because it makes immediate sense. I have a soul because I recognize a fellow soul. It takes one to know one. Encountering another embodied mind, I find myself bound up in a relation with an other, whose interiority I only ever glimpse, like a sea creature whose mysterious form flashes up suddenly from the obscure depths, only to disappear again. In such moments, we experience a direct kinship with other animals that is absent in our encounters with plants. To say this is not to demean plants or to deny their extraordinary natures. The more that scientists study plants, and fungi too, the more astonished they are by the complexity of their engagement with the world around them. Trees not only adapt and respond to environmental conditions, but communicate information to the other trees around them, warning them of danger. Nonetheless, plants lack a central nervous system or indeed any kind of neuronal structure, the minimal threshold necessary for consciousness, as far as we can tell, though a small handful of scientists have speculated that plants possess a neurobiology, citing supposed evidence of synapse-like elements in their systems. Their arguments have been refuted. In 2021, researchers at the University of Heidelberg conducted a thoroughgoing review of the relevant literature and concluded that there is no evidence whatsoever that these supposed synapse-like domains exert any of the functions of neuronal synapses. Plants simply do not have any structures resembling animal synapses, neither chemical nor electrical. The researchers added that researchers who speculate about plant cognition are misleading the public by ignoring the distinct evolutionary history and ecological adaptation of plants and animals. Simply, there is no evidence that plants are capable of the mental and emotional states we associate with first-person experiences. This point isn't merely important, it is all. For it is subjective experience, in a word, consciousness, that renders animals, including human ones, vulnerable to the kinds and qualities of harm that matter most, including trauma, suffering, loss of liberty, and death of a self. What is it like to be a bat? Assuming that other animals, like us, do have subjective experiences of some kind, the question arises of how or whether we could ever know anything concerning them, given our different physiologies. This was the very question posed by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in his celebrated 1974 essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" Presumably, Nagel proposed, it must be like something to be a bat. But what? Bats are so radically unlike us that we would seem unable to model their internal lives. It would do no good, for example, for Nagel to imagine himself with wings, soaring about, echolocating and eating insects, because he'd still be himself, Tom Nagel, the human philosopher, doing these things. The problem isn't just that other animals can't tell us about their experiences. It's that those experiences must be so unlike ours as to defy understanding. Our form seems to leave us gazing at other beings across an abyss of mutual incomprehension. As Ludwig Wittgenstein famously observed, even if a lion could talk, we wouldn't be able to understand what he said. Philosophers love to quote this line from Wittgenstein: I suspect because it confirms their own skepticism regarding animal minds. However, as Wittgenstein had no training in animal ethology and didn't even get along well with other humans, we're under no obligation to give him the last word on this subject. If Wittgenstein's and Nagel's claim is that we can never fully know what it is like to be a bat or a lion, to say nothing of a more evolutionarily distant cousin like an orb spider, then they are undeniably right. Few of us can claim even to know our own spouse fully, either, to say nothing of someone from a different culture or historical epoch. But we need to distinguish between the claim that we can know everything about the subjective experiences of other beings and the claim that we can know nothing about them. And in reality, there is a great deal we can know, or reasonably intuit, about what it's like to be a bat or an elephant, even though there is also a great deal we can't. Broadly, there are two ways we can know something about the experiences of other animals. The first is through formal scientific inquiry. The second is by relying on our own senses and emotions in observing and forming personal relationships with them. While the first method has been with us for only a few centuries, our mammalian cognition and affect have been providing us with reliable ways of knowing the world and others in it for hundreds of thousands of years. Drawing on both approaches, the scientific and the personal affective, we can grasp key aspects of the being of other animals, though again, not all. Naturalistic study of other species dates back at least to Aristotle's History of Animals, written in the 4th century BCE. Like other ancient Greeks, Aristotle viewed other species within the context of a natural hierarchy, and he held the human mind to be superior to all others. However, in contrast to the Stoics who emphasized human separateness from other species, Aristotle acknowledged that where humans and other animals were concerned, certain psychical qualities are identical with one another, whilst others resemble and others are analogous to each other. While humans may possess more of some qualities than other animals may likewise exhibit more or less of some other. Just as we find knowledge, wisdom, and sagacity in us, so in certain animals there exists some other natural potentiality akin to these. Animals, too, exhibit such temperaments as gentleness or fierceness, mildness or cross temper, courage or timidity, fear or confidence, high spirit or low cunning. We are even similar developmentally. Psychologically, a child hardly differs for the time being from an animal. The status of animals was greatly reduced in Judaism, which held that humans alone were made in the image of God. In Genesis, God instructs Adam and Eve to replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over all other animals, an injunction God repeats to Moses after the flood, telling him that the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth. Christianity later adopted this view. It also accepted the Greek conception of natural hierarchy, while jettisoning Aristotle's view of continuity between humans and other species. In the 17th century, animals lost even more ground, with philosopher René Descartes' depiction of animals as machines, soulless matter set in motion by God in obedience to natural laws. I am not worried that people say that men have an absolute empire over all the other animals, Descartes wrote in a letter, because they lack reason. Even the supposed intelligence or cunning animals was an illusion, akin to a clock which tells time better than our judgment does, due to the mechanical disposition of its parts. Charles Darwin challenged both of these ways of seeing animals. The monotheistic view that humans were uniquely made in the image of God, and Descartes' conception of animals as machines. Instead, he maintained that we and other animals share fundamental behavioral, emotional, and cognitive traits. Though Darwinism shook the pillars of human exceptionalism, however, it failed to topple them. In the 20th century, behavioral psychologists, sociobiologists, and geneticists repackaged evolutionary theory within the traditional framework of human supremacy. The Cartesian view of animals as instinctual automata, morphed into the view of animals blindly enacting behavioral scripts dictated by their DNA, in tandem with environmental and adaptive pressures. Hence the contention of Richard Dawkins, author of The Selfish Gene, that we ought to picture the animal as a robot survival machine with a pre-programmed computer controlling its muscles. Evolutionary biologists like Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, and sharp-eyed philosophers like Mary Midgley, pushed back against this gross reductionism. Unfortunately, however, they failed to purge science of its residual Cartesianism. To this day, many scientists still treat animals in the lab not as someone's embodied consciousnesses, but as animate matter to be manipulated and destroyed at the whim of the researcher. Scientists have long sought to identify some special feature of our brains that might account for the unique complexity of our minds, and thus to distinguish us absolutely from other beings. However, every neurophysiological feature once believed to be unique to our species, including domain general intelligence, lateralization, encephalization quotient, and even number of cortical neurons, has now been observed in other species. Nor are our brains organized differently than other brains. In 2020, when researchers in Tel Aviv studied brain connectivity across 130 different mammalian species, including human beings, they discovered that the brains of all mammals, from tiny mice through humans to large bulls and dolphins, exhibit equal connectivity, and information travels with the same efficiency within them. Since the brains of other animals are highly similar to our own, it is reasonable to suppose that some fundamental aspects of their subjective experiences are similar to our own as well. Comparative psychology, pharmaceutical science, and veterinary medicine are among the fields that indeed assume we can reliably intuit the internal mental and emotional states of other animals. In hundreds of experiments, all of them, in my view, morally indefensible, researchers have tested antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications on other species, inducing and then curing despair, depression, and anxiety in mice, rats, apes, and even fruit flies, to assess their efficacy for humans. It is now routine for veterinarians to prescribe Prozac and other SSRIs to treat mood disorders in cats, dogs, birds, and many other species. We may never know what it is exactly like to be a bat, but evidently we know something about what it is like to be a depressed bat. SETI phone home. Homo sapiens has been walking the planet for 300,000 years. It's therefore all the more noteworthy that in the next 50 years we could learn that we are not the only intelligent species in the cosmos. So observes astronomer Seth Shostak, a leading researcher with the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Project, or SETI, an international team of researchers scanning the heavens in the hopes of detecting the radio waves that might indicate the existence of life on other worlds. If only SETI scientists were to turn their powerful telescopes towards Earth, however, they might be amazed to discover a planet teeming with myriad other forms of intelligent life, other ways of feeling, perceiving, and thinking which, though alien to our own, are no less wondrous. No one disputes that the perceptual abilities of other animals far outstrip our own. Bats and dolphins echolocate, birds see the magnetic field of the earth. Fishes and dolphins can sense electrical fields in other animals. The human eye contains 3 kinds of cone receptors. Bony fishes have 4, enabling them to see colors we can't. Dogs have 2 olfactory systems, including one we lack entirely, Jacobson's organ. If you make the analogy of a dog's sense of smell to vision, scientist James Walker explains, what you and I can see at 1/3 of a mile, a dog could see more than 3,000 miles away and still see as well. Taking our dog on a brisk walk, we may mistake our companion's desire to linger and sniff everything for sheer obstinacy. But the dog takes a different view. Plunged into a world of sensorial riches, she turns her analytical interest to the complex relationships she perceives unfolding through time. Hurrying a dog on a stroll is like asking an art connoisseur to take in the Louvre's 6 miles of galleries on the back of a speeding motorcycle. Non-human animals far outclass us not only in senses but in speed, agility, reflexes, strength, and endurance. Human runners collapse from exhaustion after completing the 26-mile Boston Marathon. The bar-tailed godwit, a small New Zealand seabird, flies 75 miles during its biannual migration without stopping. Peregrine falcons achieve airspeeds of up to 240 miles per hour, executing turns so extreme that the G-forces would render the crew of a fighter jet unconscious, if not kill them outright. Because we identify intelligence and consciousness with the mind, not the body, a prejudice dating back to the ancient Greeks, we tend to undervalue such feats, viewing them as mindless. But the ability to discriminate objects in one's environment and to coordinate the movement of one's body in space takes intelligence and judgment. From the perspective of an outfielder, a baseball leaping off the end of a bat at 80 miles an hour appears as a mere speck rocketing upwards. How then is the fielder able to position him or herself in space at just the right moment to catch it? The equation for calculating a ballistics trajectory is y equals h plus x tan alpha gx2o slash 2v02 cos2o alpha. I had to look that up. However, I have yet to see an outfielder whip out a pocket calculator. Instead, the fielder works the problem through in an intelligent but embodied way, feeling his or her way into the ball's descending arc. Professional ball players catch about 80% of the balls that come their way. Dogs probably do as well or better, chasing frisbees and rubber balls. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is one of 7 forms of intelligence in humans identified by the psychologist Howard Gardner, the others being logical, mathematical, spatial, musical, linguistic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. All 7 forms have been observed in other species. As it is beyond my scope to review the enormous research literature on the scientific study of animal minds, I will only touch on some highlights here. Let me say at the outset, however, that I do not condone the unethical methods used to obtain much of this data. All such research founders on a contradiction. We have no choice but to experiment on animals, scientists say, owing to the close similarities between their physiology, neurology, and psychology and our own. Yet we are morally permitted to exploit and kill them, they also say, because they are so unlike us as to be unworthy of our fundamental respect. But we can't have it both ways, weaponizing both their similarities to us and differences from us against them. Most of us recall the tree of evolution from middle school science class, with protozoa at the roots, multicellular organisms higher up, then fishes and birds, then mammals, then apes, and finally Homo sapiens perched on the highest branch. All evolutionary roads are shown to lead to us, the pinnacle of creation. But this picture turns out to be wrong. There is no scientific evidence of a fixed hierarchy in cognition between different phyla and classes of animals. As the primatologist Franz de Waal observed, the notion that there is a linear cognitive scale, in which intelligence proceeds from a low end to a high end, is simply a myth. In 1960, Jane Goodall, a young primatologist conducting field research in Gom National Park in Tanzania, discovered that chimpanzees used twigs as tools to capture termites, appending centuries of prejudice about the capabilities of other species. Since her discovery, chimpanzees have been observed using many other tools in culturally variable ways. In Bausu and Gom, for example, chimps use rocks as hammers and anvils, while in Fangali, chimps chew on leaves to rid themselves of hiccups. Other chimps fashion sandals out of leaves and twigs to protect their sensitive feet. Tool use is also common among other apes. Gorillas have been observed breaking off tree branches to use while wading into water, to test the depth of the water in front of them, while female macaques have been seen using stones to masturbate. Scientists long framed intelligent behavior in apes as proto-human. Since apes are evolutionarily close to us, it was to be expected that they should be capable of doing some of the same things we can, if only in an inferior way. By studying apes, the thinking went, we can peer back into our own evolutionary past, seeing in the mirror of nature a cruder reflection of ourselves. We now know, though, that complex cognition and feeling are found not just in apes but in many other species. Snakes and other reptiles, for example, are able to learn mazes and make visual discriminations as rapidly as most birds and mammals, while the cognitive abilities of some marine fishes compare to or surpass those of apes. Tool use, too, has now been observed in many non-ape species. Orange-dotted tuskfish use rocks to break open shells. Octopuses have been observed carrying the half-shells of coconuts, then looking for other half-shells with which to create makeshift shelters. New Caledonian crows fashion twigs into tools for different purposes and bring their tools with them when they move. Green herons fish using bread as bait, exhibiting a subtle understanding of fish behavior and psychology. Dolphins impale sea sponges on their beaks to shield themselves from the prickly spines of the urchins they forage, and teach one another how to use them. A particularly innovative use of tools was observed in a captive dolphin named Kelly at the Institute for Marine Mammal Studies in Mississippi. After researchers rewarded the dolphins with fish for turning in scraps of paper littering their pool, Kelly began stashing pieces of paper under a rock at the bottom of the pool, then tearing off small pieces one at a time to turn in for multiple rewards. As journalist Lisa Langley recounts, Kelly then upped the ante. One day, when a gull flew into her pool, she grabbed it, waited for the trainers, and then gave it to them. It was a large bird, and so the trainers gave her lots of fish. This seemed to give Kelly a new idea. The next time she was fed, instead of eating the last fish, she took it to the bottom of the pool and hid it under the rock where she had been hiding the paper. When no trainers were present, she brought the fish to the surface and used it to lure the gulls, which she would catch to get even more fish. After mastering this lucrative strategy, she taught her calf, who taught other calves, and so gull baiting has become a hot game among the dolphins. Despite the fact that dolphins have been shown to be self-aware, have complex emotions, and transmit knowledge from one generation to the next, the definition of culture, scientists nonetheless continue to abduct them from the wild, to hold them captive against their will in tanks and pools, and to force them to participate in experiments. Animals also exhibit a practical awareness of causality and of the basic physical principles they need to survive. While only humans have quantum physics, other species needn't entertain formal scientific theories in order to understand the way natural objects behave, or to use that knowledge in an improvisatory and intelligent way. Apes confronted with a desirable object floating in a pool cast stones behind it, using the ripples to bring the object within reach. At a zoo in Sweden, a chimp responding to a youngster being strangled by a rope carefully lifted him first to relieve pressure on his neck, before attempting to remove the rope. Seabirds drop shells onto rocks or other hard surfaces to break them open, showing an intuitive grasp of the relation between height, gravity, and force of impact on a falling body. Good experimentalists, they try different heights and surfaces to achieve their desired results. Corvids presented with a worm floating inside a narrow glass, beyond their reach, will toss pebbles into the glass to raise the desired object, showing an understanding of Archimedes' principle of volume displacement. The birds also appreciate the difference between objects with buoyant properties and ones that sink and displace water. Chimps too know to raise objects in a glass by pouring water into it, and will urinate into the glass if no other means are available. Human toddlers, meanwhile, fail the water displacement test entirely. Many people now accept that chimps, elephants, gorillas, crows, parrots, dolphins, and whales are intelligent, thanks to the documentary My Octopus Teacher, about a diver's friendship with a mollusk off the coast of South Africa. Cephalopods, too, have been admitted into the exclusive pantheon of animals said to exhibit human-like intelligence. Horrifically, a number of companies are developing octopus farms to raise and kill millions of octopuses in industrialized conditions. The trouble with our obsession with so-called smart animals, however, is that it only reinforces the supposed general rule of animal stupidity. In reality, the evidence shows sophisticated cognition to be common throughout the animal realm. One of our most prejudicial beliefs about other species is that they're trapped in an eternal present, like Clive Waring, the famous British amnesiac who lost his ability to recall anything that happened more than 30 seconds before. Since temporality is the basis of the biographical self, an inability to navigate in time might suggest that other animals lack such a self. But we now know that other species, too, orient themselves by looking backwards and forwards in time. Only humans appear able to conceive of events in the extremely distant past or future, such as the extinction of the dinosaurs or the projected explosion of our sun billions of years from now. However, these are cultural experiences made possible by language. At an individual level, ethologist Leslie Rogers suggests, the memory abilities of animals do not differ, qualitatively, in many cases from those of humans. Furthermore, our working memory isn't even the most advanced on Earth. At the Primate Research Institute at Kyoto University, a chimpanzee named Ayumu is able to recall the order and spatial location of the numbers 1 through 9, when flashed for 210 milliseconds on a computer screen. Ayumu is able to get the right numbers in the right order nearly every time with 80% accuracy, something no human has managed so far. Even when college students are given numerous practice sessions, Ayuma radically outperforms them. Many other animals also exhibit excellent episodic memory, the ability to recall things that happened to them. Mice recognize the faces and even the perfume of the laboratory researchers who experiment on them. Chickens remember their mother and siblings their entire lives. Clark's nutcracker can stash and remember the location of up to 20,000 food caches, scattered over many square miles of the Rockies. Male hooded warblers are able to recognize the songs of birds that had been their neighbors the previous season. Sheep, shown dozens of photographs of other sheep, can accurately identify their individual faces 2 years later, a level of facial recall rivaling that of primates. Darwin noted that animals often call to each other when separated and evidently feel much joy at meeting, as we see with a horse on the return of his companion, for whom he has been neighing. Captive dolphins respond to the unique signature whistles names of former tank mates, even if their shared confinement lasted only briefly. One dolphin recognized the call of a friend she hadn't seen in 20 years. Two elephants who'd crossed paths in a circus 23 years earlier likewise recognized and excitedly greeted one another. Memory would be a useless adaptation, though, if animals couldn't use it to anticipate future events. Whales keep track of peak periods of phytoplankton density in distant feeding grounds. Other species, too, may travel hundreds or thousands of miles to find mates or food, suggesting an ability to form a mental image of the future and to plan accordingly, in order to arrive at the right place at the right time. Hammerheads know when and where to expect wrasses, the small fishes who swim into the mouths of larger fish to feed on parasites there, to be at their cleaning stations. Gobies stranded in a drying tidal pool know where the neighboring pools lie for them to leap into, suggesting that the fish commit the ocean floor's topography to memory during high tide, a feat unlikely to be achieved by any human. Chimps make temporal maps of hundreds of fruit-bearing trees, traveling long distances to arrive when the fruit has ripened. Primates have been observed gathering straw to be used as bedding later in the day, and assembling tools for later use in foraging. At a zoo in Sweden, one chimpanzee was observed in the early morning hours collecting and piling up rocks to throw at zoo visitors later in the day. After zookeepers caught on and took away his rock stashes, the chimp was seen breaking off pieces of brittle concrete from the walls in his enclosure to store and throw instead. Animals also form detailed mental maps of their surroundings. Gray whales migrate thousands of miles between their nurseries off Mexico and their feeding grounds in the Arctic. Elephants find their way to watering holes across hundreds of miles of savanna. Ocean-going fishes navigate in part using subtle changes in underwater sounds, caused by distant land formations and different water depths. Akin to finding your way from Manhattan to Boston, listening for echoes off the Empire State Building and Fenway Park. Birds, too, have an exceptional grasp of space. When I lived in Chicago, I saw pigeons riding the subway to get around, hopping off calmly at particular stations. Pigeons in London have been seen doing the same thing using the underground. Memorizing a subway route, though, is child's play compared to mapping a continent, something birds do routinely during their migrations. Birds are believed to take their bearings using not only the position of the sun and constellations, but also scent, acoustical cues, cloud movements, the Earth's magnetic field, and visual landmarks. They also make continuous in-flight decisions about which navigational cues to prioritize, adjusting their course to take into account weather and wind drift. For centuries, it was assumed that mammals were smarter than birds, whose evolutionary path diverged from our own some 280 million years ago. We now know, however, that avian brains are just made differently. Though birds don't have a cerebral cortex, they have a homologous organ, the pallium, which exhibits a similar layered architecture. Ounce for ounce, the avian brain is more powerful than the mammalian brain, exhibiting such elegance and efficiency in organization that scientists have compared it to a supercomputer. Furthermore, the same capacities found in our brains, such as long-term memory and domain general intelligence, have been observed in avian brains too. Avian minds show such astonishing depth of perceptual awareness and cognitive sophistication that they are now recognized as rivaling or exceeding those of primates. Pigeons outperform humans in some forms of statistical inference, like the Monty Hall problem, and can be taught to distinguish between different French impressionists. They also understand the concepts of time and space. Chickens learn from one another, have at least 24 different words or vocalizations for warning one another of predators, and take account of their own prior experience and knowledge when working out problems. Our species appears to be peerless in its ability to dissociate from immediate context by manipulating abstract signs. Thanks to our capacity for language, we have evolved the protean ability to transform nature and ourselves in nearly limitless ways, for good and ill. But other animals, too, use signs to communicate thoughts and feelings to one another. The philosopher Montaigne observed in the 16th century that other animals are able to communicate with one another, that they understand one another, and not only those of the same species, but also those of different species. Even in those creatures that have no voice, we may easily infer, from the mutual services we see them rendering each other, that they have some other means of communication. Their movements speak and negotiate. Just as well our deaf-mutes dispute, argue, and tell stories by means of signs. Lovers use their eyes to express anger, reconciliation, entreaty, thanks, to make appointments, in short, for every purpose. With the head we invite, we dismiss, admit, disclaim, give the lie, welcome, honor, reverence, disdain, demand, show the door, we cheer, lament, caress, chide, submit, defy, exhort, threat, assure, and inquire. Researchers have shown that dogs understand denotative as well as connotative speech. Not only what is said to them, but how meaning changes according to context and emotional register. As Montaigne observed, a horse knows that a dog is angry when it barks a certain way, but is not afraid when it gives voice in another way. Birds make urgent appeals to other birds for help in mobbing a predator like a hawk, with individuals of different species often joining the attack. Scientists have found that many animals pay close attention to the alarm calls of other species. Spying a hawk, say, a tufted titmouse or chickadee may broadcast that information to a wider public, in an alarm propagating through a forest at speeds of 100 miles per hour or more. They often do this, moreover, at a frequency above the hearing of many predators, in what researcher Eric Green terms a private channel. While many scientists remain skeptical that other animals possess true language, others are open to the idea. Dolphins have been shown to understand syntax and compound sentences, and Kanzi, the bonobo, can understand hundreds of sentences spoken in English. Alex, the captive African gray parrot, could verbally describe in English objects he'd never seen before, identifying them by color, shape, and material. Vervets have different warning cries for snakes, leopards, and eagles. Prairie dogs likewise learn the names of different predators and can even vary the acoustical elements of their cries to communicate their size, color, and shape. They also create new phonemes to refer to novel objects. One group of prairie dogs assigned the label danger to a man whom they'd seen fire a shotgun more than a month earlier. What about insects? Until recently, scientists assumed that insects, spiders, mollusks, and other invertebrates, the vast majority of all animal species, lack sophisticated cognition. According to Roger D. Hanlon, however, an authority on cognition in cephalopods at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, it is nonsense to suppose that vertebrates are the smartest things around. Some mollusks have indeed now been shown to be as intelligent as primates, and the cognitive abilities of arthropods like insects and spiders are getting a closer look as well. Though we assume that a small being must correspondingly have only a small degree of consciousness, if any, we may just be too hung up on size. In fact, the largest insects and spiders are larger than the smallest mammals and birds, exposing the fallacy of conflating brain size with cognitive ability. But even in extremely small creatures, scientists have uncovered evidence of astonishingly sophisticated cognition. Insect researchers Chitka and Niven observe that while early computers weighed a ton or more and occupied a whole room, yet were capable only of limited arithmetic, calculators today outperform such machines by orders of magnitude and fit inside our pocket. It is the technology within which matters, not the size, and the same principle applies to brains. The smaller scale of insects allows their neurons to send information more quickly and efficiently than bulkier brains, whose longer connections increase conduction delays and energetic costs. There may thus be an inverse relationship between brain size and brain efficiency. Chitka and Niven speculate that the ability to learn rules and to form concepts emerged as adaptive strategies because of, rather than despite, the miniaturization of the insect brain, which may explain why scientists have found levels of neuronal plasticity in insects comparable to that of vertebrates. Furthermore, the neuronal circuits of insects behave in much the same way as they do in vertebrates, performing similar functions. Dozens of different kinds of learning have been identified in insects, including learning sequence steps to achieve a goal, contextual learning, and the ability to generalize experiential knowledge to new phenomena. As one researcher notes, the number of cues used by ants to navigate, including sun position, polarized light patterns, visual panoramas, gradient of odors, wind direction, slope, ground texture, step counting, and others, is probably greater than for humans. In The Structure of Behavior, 1942, the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty refuted the behaviorist view of animals as merely reacting to stimuli. Rather, animals actively maintain an equilibrium rooted in their own general attitude toward the world. Animals don't merely receive sense impressions passively, but make meaning of their worlds. When challenged with a novel problem, for example, animals go off script, improvising a solution. Merleau-Ponty described one cruel experiment performed by behaviorists in which the scientists took a beetle and taped together two of its legs to see whether it would move in the same way as before. Instead, the insect used different muscles to improvise an entirely new form of locomotion. Even an insect, then, will resolve a problem posed by its milieu in a non-stereotyped, creative way. Subsequent research has proven Merleau-Ponty right. Other animals simply don't behave in the mechanistic way that neo-Cartesianists have maintained. Some scientists are at last coming around to Merleau-Ponty's view. Insects are not the hardwired reflex automats they were once believed to be, one team of researchers recently announced. In 2017, researchers at Queen Mary University in London taught bumblebees to roll a tiny soccer ball into a goal. Though rolling an object into a hole was a task no bee had been called upon to do in the previous 130 million years, the bees quickly mastered the task and even improved on the method they'd been taught. Some bees, Smithsonian later reported, succeeded at getting their ball into the goal with no demonstration at all, or by first watching the ball move on its own. The most successful bees were those who'd watched other bees solve the problem. However, the bees didn't just copy what they saw. After observing their companions, they then figured out on their own how to accomplish the task even more efficiently using their own techniques. The lead scientist on the study, Clint Perry, noted that while people view insects as unthinking machines, the experiment showed that bees can think for themselves. In an interview, Perry conceded that the bees probably showed more creativity in solving the problem than he himself might have in a similar scenario. Other researchers have demonstrated that bees can count, grasp concepts of same and different, and can apply knowledge from one sensory context, like hearing, to another, like sight. The rate at which honeybees can learn new colors, meanwhile, is not just superior to human infants, but to all vertebrates that have been studied. The cognitive architecture of invertebrates, in fact, seems to resemble that of vertebrates, at least in some ways. Like us, they have been shown to perceive in gestalts, focusing their perception on specific objects while blurring out the rest of their sensory and experiential field, suggesting that they too ascribe meaning to their experiences. Sleeping jumping spiders exhibit signs of REM sleep, just like cats, dogs, parrots, cuttlefish, and us. Wasps and moths can recognize individual faces. When insects and spiders are given mood-altering drugs, they behave in much the same way that humans do. Spiders given LSD build cockamamie webs, while bees given cocaine act impulsively, exhibit altered judgment, show exaggerated enthusiasm for things they like, and later exhibit symptoms of withdrawal. Such results raise disturbing questions about the ethics of treating even insects as disposable fodder in invasive experiments. We know enough already to call for a moratorium on all such research, to say nothing of the farming of insects for food. An estimated 1 trillion or more insects are already raised and killed each year for human consumption, and to feed animals raised for slaughter. Plans by the meat industry, already underway, to raise and kill quadrillions more insects for commercial food purposes are simply unconscionable. Other nations. In 1925, the naturalist Henry Beston built a small cottage on a beach in Eastham, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. With the Nauset marshes at his back and the Atlantic Ocean as his doorstep, Beston spent the next 2 years closely observing the comings and goings of the gulls, terns, crabs, sand spiders, and other denizens of the intertidal zone. Reflecting later on his experiences in his book The Outermost House, Beston wrote, "We need another and a wiser, and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creature through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate for having taken form so far below ourselves, and therein do we err, for the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with the extension of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren, they are not underlings, they are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. We are not alone, but are surrounded by other consciousnesses, other worlds, and each such world is a singularity worth valuing on its own terms. Persons, not things. In 2014, New York State Supreme Court Judge Barbara Jaffe issued a writ of habeas corpus in response to a suit filed by the nonprofit Non-Human Rights Project, NHRP, on behalf of Hercules and Leo, two chimpanzees being held captive by Stony Brook University. A habeas writ, which requires authorities holding a person in custody to present him or her before the court, is one of the most fundamental principles of jurisprudence, the bedrock of the protection of persons. For decades, Hercules and Leo had been kept in a basement laboratory at the university, where they were implanted with electrodes and subjected to locomotion studies requiring repeated anesthesia. In an unprecedented order, the judge now ordered Stony Brook's president to appear in court to answer the NHRP's allegations that the chimps were being unlawfully detained. It was the first time a non-human had been granted habeas standing in a modern court of law. After the judge's order was reported in the press, Judge Jaffe backtracked, removing the habeas writ. Yet as the case proceeded, Jaffe seemed skeptical of the university's arguments. Christopher Calston, the assistant attorney general defending Stony Brook, maintained that since the chimps had the status of property, they had no standing to file a grievance through human representatives. They have no ability to partake in human society, the society that has developed these rights, he told the court. Calston warned that granting the chimps personhood would create a slippery slope regarding the rights of other animals. But Judge Jaffe seemed unconvinced. The law evolves according to new discoveries in social mores, she observed. Isn't it incumbent on judiciaries to at least consider whether a class of beings may be granted a right? In the end, the court decided against the plaintiffs. But the embarrassing publicity around the case led Stony Brook to quietly retire Hercules and Leo to an animal sanctuary a few years later, sparing them further suffering. Meanwhile, the profound metaphysical and ethical questions raised by Non-Human Rights Project concerning the nature of personhood have remained unanswered by the courts. Can a mere animal be considered a person? The dictionary suggests otherwise. Emphatically, as distinguished from a thing or from the lower animals, reads one definition of person in the Oxford English Dictionary. Historically, philosophers have tended to associate personhood with a capacity for reason and the qualities associated with it, such as freedom and autonomy. On this view, only thinking beings are free, as only they are capable of making choices about their lives and values. It was Aristotle's view, thus, that neither children nor animals could be considered good or bad, moral or immoral, since they lacked the rationality needed to exercise virtue. Later philosophers would expound some version of his view, most notably Immanuel Kant, who argued that only rational, self-determining beings, ones capable of evaluating and affirming objective moral principles, could rightly be considered persons. While humans exhibited such qualities, Kant held, other animals are not rational, and they are therefore called things. Other animals can therefore only have value relative to the uses that we make of them. To put the matter differently, the question of who gets to count as a person traces the bounds of permissible violence. Only beings who are human are deemed worthy of life. As critics have pointed out, however, if only rational and autonomous beings are persons, then it's not clear that many humans qualify either. As the scholars Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka note, the capacity to engage in rational argumentation and to conform to consciously understood principles is, at best, a fragile achievement even for humans, a fluctuating characteristic that varies not only across human beings, but also across time within a life. By Kant's definition, dolphins and apes can't be considered persons, since they appear not to engage in formal moral reasoning. But it is equally clear that many humans, including young children, the mentally disabled, and the severely mentally ill, wouldn't qualify as persons in Kant's sense either. To ground human rights in Kant's narrow conception of personhood is therefore to render human rights insecure for everyone. Constitutional law scholar Lawrence Tribe made this very point in an amicus brief before the New York Supreme Court in 2020 on behalf of a different suit brought by the Non-Human Rights Project. This one involving an elephant with the unfortunate name of Happy, captured as an infant in Thailand in 1971, then sold to an abusive animal entertainment group in California. Happy was eventually bought by the Bronx Zoo, where she lived for decades in a desolate environment with other captive elephants, made to perform tricks for the zoo's visitors. By the 2000s, Happy was living in solitary confinement and exhibiting such severe symptoms of depression that the New York Times branded her the world's loneliest elephant. In his brief, Tribe chastised the court for its earlier ruling in the Hercules and Leo case that chimpanzees and all other non-human animals are not fit candidates for personhood on the mere ground that they are not human. The court had denied personhood to chimps on grounds that they lacked human language, and thus couldn't be bearers of social responsibilities and duties. Tribe, however, faulted the court for affirming a fundamentally flawed definition of legal personhood, one with the unintended consequence of placing human rights at risk. 2. The narcissist in the mirror. The Non-Human Rights Project has itself been criticized by some scholars sympathetic to animal rights for focusing its briefs on so-called smart animals, ones whose cognitive and behavioral repertoires can most closely be said to resemble our own. The NHRP's hope is that once some animals have been granted legal recognition as persons, it will eventually become possible to achieve legal personhood for members of other species as well. However, even if the NHRP won legal recognition of orcas, elephants, chimps, and dolphins, the species that have so far been the focus of the NHRP's efforts, 99.99% of all animal species would still retain the status of property or things under the law. One of the ways the Non-Human Rights Project has sought to challenge the exclusion of non-humans from the legal category of persons is to introduce scientific evidence from the mirror test, which purports to demonstrate self-awareness. As its name suggests, the test was invented in the 1970s by Gordon Gallup, Jr., to assess the ability of chimpanzees to recognize themselves in a mirror. After showing the chimps a mirror and observing their behavior, Gallup anesthetized them and painted a mark on their foreheads. Once they had come to, Gallup gave them the mirror again. What he found is that chimps used the mirror to investigate the strange new spot on their foreheads, suggesting that they knew that the ape in the mirror was themselves. In subsequent experiments, chimps used mirrors to peer inside their mouths and investigate other parts of their bodies normally hidden from view. Scientists have since discovered that several other species, too, are able to recognize themselves in mirrors, including bottlenose dolphins, whales, gorillas, elephants, magpies, and cleaner wrasses. The NHRP argues that any species able to recognize themselves in a mirror must possess the quality of self-awareness, a key property of persons. As with other cognitive litmus tests designed to separate persons from non-persons, however, the mirror test is flawed. First, it is unclear what passing the mirror test really means. Some have speculated that the ability to conceive of oneself as a distinct self may be limited to species with complex social orders in which the ability to see oneself as others do might be a useful adaptation. However, if so, it is unclear why wrasses, who don't have complex social networks, pass the mirror recognition test, while macaques and parrots who do fail it. Furthermore, it is unclear whether the ability to understand a representation of oneself, as in a mirror or photograph, is a necessary or sufficient condition for having or being a self. Cats fail the mirror test. But if I were to put a dab of paint on my cat's paw or some other part of her body within her sight while she is awake, she would immediately investigate it and try to lick it off. She would also wonder what I am up to and look at me with bewilderment or suspicion. If animals lacked the ability to distinguish between themselves and others, they would not be such shrewd judges of the intentions of others, which, however, they are. Dogs and cats can tell the difference between someone who steps on them by accident and someone who does so deliberately. When I tug on my cat's tail in a playful way, she knows I'm teasing. But if I were to pull her tail sharply or suddenly shout at her, she would react with alarm. Were I to repeat my aggressive behavior, our relationship would suffer and she would stop trusting me altogether. My cat understands that I am not her and that she is not me, and she interprets tail pulling in the context of our relationship. If a stranger should visit my house and try to pull my cat's tail, she would likely react with some combination of fear, anger, and confusion, the way you or I would react if a stranger on an elevator were suddenly to grab at our face or leg. The ability to recognize oneself in a mirror, in short, ought not to be conflated with having a self. Nor is it clear why recognizing oneself in a mirror should be taken as the threshold for ascribing moral worth to a life. Children with autism can have difficulty recognizing themselves in a mirror. The age threshold for passing the mirror test, meanwhile, is culturally variable. In the US and other wealthy countries of the global north, most children pass the mirror test after the age of about 24 months, while some Kenyan children between the ages of 2 and 6 years fail it. Does that mean that Kenyan children aren't self-aware? Should we cease treating them as persons or grant them fewer rights? My friend's adult daughter, Esther, has an undiagnosed neurological disability that makes it impossible for her to do most basic math, to grasp the difference between utilitarianism and Kantianism, or to live without constant assistance from others. Despite her disability, however, Esther is one of the most compassionate and emotionally perceptive people I know. She is also quite intelligent, even though her mind travels down quirkier paths than the ones traveled by the neurotypical person. Is she not a person? During my father's battle with Alzheimer's, there came a time in the progression of his disease when he was no longer able to recognize himself in the full-length mirror in the hallway outside his bedroom. Seeing his own reflection, he would mistake it for a stranger and speak to it. By this time, too, my father had forgotten not only who I and my sisters were, but also who he was. So profound was his loss of self that, when he sneezed, he would say, "Bless you," as if someone else had sneezed. My father's illness obliterated so much of his identity that it eventually made it impossible for him to care for himself. In the last year of his life, he came to exhibit less of a capacity for memory, self and other relations, practical autonomy, and situational awareness than Zorro and Sundance, the two corgi dogs whom he and his partner Donna lived with. Yet until a stroke ended his life, my father remained an affable and loving presence who took pleasure and interest in life. Even in his diminished state, he hadn't ceased to be a someone, despite his inability to recognize himself as a someone. Thinking differently about personhood, it is clear that the traditional ways philosophers have gone about defining persons have been flawed. While moral deliberation, language, abstract reasoning, and the ability to conceive of oneself in the third person are worthwhile capacities to have, they in no way exhaust the qualities of being a person, whether in our species or any other. Nor is it self-evident why those capacities should be taken to be the most important, or sole, defining attributes of personhood, rather than, say, the ability to love and be loved, to experience loss, to possess joie de vivre, etc. The philosopher Tom Regan proposed the term subject of a life as a workaround to Kant's overly strict conception of persons, suggesting that we see every animal as the experiencing subject of a life, a conscious creature having an individual welfare that has importance to that subject. We and other animals want and prefer things, believe and feel things, recall and expect things, and all these dimensions of our life, including our pleasure and pain, our enjoyment and suffering, our satisfaction and frustration, our continued existence or our untimely death, all make a difference to the quality of our life as lived, as experienced, by us as individuals. It's because animals are subjects of a life that they have an integrity that we ought to respect. It follows, Regan maintained, that we ought to end our exploitation and killing of animals for food, medical experiments, and other uses. I agree with Regan's approach, though subject of a life seems to me an unnecessarily baroque term to describe something as plain as consciousness. All of the following terms, therefore, seem to me equally good. Consciousness, self, person, individual, singularity, subject of a life, embodied mind, being in the world, someone. Since person is a common term denoting the dignity and inviolability of an individual, I prefer that one. However, any of the other terms will do nearly as well, since all are attempts to describe the same phenomenon, a singular or unique existent with a subjective experience of the world. Minimally, we may hold the following qualities to be constitutive of consciousness, hence of persons or someone's: subjective experience, emotions, intelligence, intentionality, practical autonomy, temporality, vulnerability, mortality, and personality, individuality. So defined, all vertebrates and most if not all complex invertebrates can be seen to exhibit the qualities of persons, while plants, bacteria, viruses, fungi, machines, and simple animal organisms without a nervous system, like amoeba, sponges, and trichoplax, do not. Thus, you, your cousin, your cat, and the mice living under your sink can reasonably be characterized as persons, but not your rhododendron, your mountain bike, ChatGPT, or the bacteria living in your gut. What makes animals persons is not that they have human-like characteristics, but that they exhibit qualities of a self, i.e., of a being who possesses thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. To be a self or consciousness is not merely to have a perspective, it is to be a perspective, a someone who experiences the world from a point of view, an I who knows, who feels, suffers, desires, etc. And as every animal species has its own ontology or distinctive style of existence, there are as many different ways of being a someone as there are unique species. Being an otter, being a carpenter ant, being a long-tailed hawk, being a cuttlefish, and so on, are all ways of being a person, even if they differ in fundamental ways from being a human. To be a person or someone is to be pleased or frightened, bored or curious, certain or doubtful. It is to seek freedom and to flourish within one's capacities. Persons take sensuous joy in their embodiment, in the power and virtuosity of free movement, running, leaping, soaring, diving, bounding. Persons often seek out the company and comfort of others. Many form enduring bonds of affection or love with others, particularly with their young. They enjoy sex and a languid nap in the sun. Persons go through similar stages of life, from the playful curiosity and impetuosity of youth to the world weariness and infirmity of old age, approaching the end of the life cycle sans eyes, sans teeth, sans everything. Some animals live only hours or days, others live longer than we do. Crocodiles and orcas can live into their 90s, tortoises to 150 years, koi fish to 200 years, and Greenland sharks and quahogs to 500 years, or more. Persons fear death, and they experience anxiety or distress witnessing the death of others of their kind. Scientists found that fruit flies who merely saw other dead fruit flies aged more quickly and died 30% sooner than flies spared the awful sight. To be a person is to be susceptible to cold and hunger, disease and disability, violence from others, etc., in a word, to suffer the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Persons feel the ache of hunger, the pain of toothaches, broken wings and injured fins, and the misery of viral infections, diarrhea, flu, and insomnia. To be a person is to be vulnerable to loneliness and despair, trauma and grief, intentionality and autonomy. Though many philosophers have denied autonomy to other animals, the evidence shows that other species exhibit what the late animal law scholar Steve Wise, founder of the Non-Human Rights Project, called practical autonomy. As Montaigne observed, other animals don't operate merely from instinct, but with reason and foresight. Do the swallows that we see at the return of spring, ferreting out all the corners of the houses, conduct their search without judgment? Do they choose without discrimination, out of 1,000 places, that which is most commodious for their lodging? Are the birds, when they weave those beautiful and wonderful habitations of theirs, able to use a square figure rather than a round, an obtuse rather than a right angle, without knowing their properties and effects? Do they fetch, now water, now clay, without having concluded that hardness is softened by moisture? Do they line the floors of their palaces with moss or down, unless they have foreseen that the tender limbs of their young will lie more softly and comfortably? Do they shelter themselves from rainy wind and build their cabins to the east, without knowing the different properties of the winds, and without considering which one is more healthy for them than the other? Why does the spider thicken her web in one place and slacken it another? Why does she use now one kind of knot, now another, unless she possesses thought, deliberation, and the power of inference? The intelligent autonomy we see in other species, their ability to solve problems and make choices, is a manifestation of the intentional quality of consciousness. Every consciousness, that is at every moment directed towards something of significance to that consciousness, some phenomenon, whether it be an unexpected sound in the forest, an aching tooth, or a tennis match. To have consciousness is not merely to be in the world, it is to have a world. That is, consciousness is always ascribing meaning to the world. The mouse who narrowly escapes an attack by an owl at night, fleeing to the safety of her burrow, experiences something of significance to her. Her emotional responses, her terror at being attacked, her relief at being safely home again, her uncertainty about when it will be safe to venture out again, etc., arise from a personal existential situation. Having narrowly escaped an attack from the air, the mouse will subsequently experience the sky differently than before, as a newly vivid horizon of danger. Her heightened awareness of vulnerability, born of an intelligence in no way separable from her feelings, memories, and the meaning with which she encounters and constitutes her world, will alter the structure of her subjective life world. The significance that animals give to their worlds is evident in everything they do, from seeking new living quarters to forming emotional relationships with others. As Carol Gigliotti shows in her wonderful book The Creative Lives of Animals, animals confront the challenges of their lives in spontaneous, creative ways, with flair, innovation, and joy. Play, a feature of this creativity, offers a clear example of intentionality in other animals. Bears blow air bubbles in streams, then pop them with their claws. Bored captive octopuses use their funnels to blow jets of water at plastic bottles, repeatedly sending them floating under the water purifier of their tank to be returned to them again. Crows fashion sleds out of the lids of cans or other objects, then use them to ski down icy slopes or roofs. Beluga whales put stones or seaweed on their heads, daring others to knock them off. Alaskan buffalo have been observed running down to a frozen lake and skating across the surface, keeping their limbs stiff to do pirouettes on the ice. Animals will create games even with members of other species, like sea otters striking up games of chase with dogs on California piers. Coyotes, armadillos, sheep, cows, and others have been seen rolling, pushing, or tossing a ball around, just for fun. By animating the ball as if it were alive, they imbue it with a significance that it did not have before. The animal knows that the ball isn't sentient or alive, yet pretends otherwise by attacking, nuzzling, or cuddling it. Once the animal turns his or her intentional gaze elsewhere, the object again resumes its place as merely a thing among other things. Someone home, consciousness as singularity. Every consciousness unfolds within the bounded conditions set for it by evolution, exhibiting the psychological, perceptual, cognitive, and emotional repertoire particular to its species. At the same time, every consciousness remains always itself alone, a singularity. Just as no two bodies can coincide in space and time, no two consciousnesses ever coincide. Each remains its own horizon of possibilities. No I coincides even wholly with itself. Every consciousness reaches beyond itself, beyond the horizon of what it is given. It remains always a free, spontaneous agent of its own existence. Scientists were once skeptical of individuation in other species. When Japanese primate researcher Junichiro Itani toured the United States in the late 1950s, claiming to be able to recognize each of the more than 100 monkeys he studied as a distinct individual, American scientists simply didn't believe him. Monkeys look so much alike, Franz Duval recounts, that Itani obviously was making things up. But he wasn't. Each monkey was indeed unique, as his research showed. Even today, as ethologist Leslie J. Rogers observes, we tend to view other animals as unitary entities, all possessing the same characteristics, ignoring individual differences, as in Pollan's eternal pig. It has now been shown conclusively, however, that genetic and environmental variance ensures that no two members of any species are the same. Scientists studying captive octopuses have found each to be unique. Some are curious and outgoing and crave human connection, while others are moody and hold grudges against individuals they dislike. Individual fish, too, have unique temperaments, preferences, and eccentricities. Even insects within the same species exhibit personality variance. Some are bold while others are timid or easily discouraged. Some are gregarious while others are antisocial. We can only guess at what subtle aspects of temperament we are missing in studying beings whose evolutionary paths diverged from our own eons ago. Personality variance has been demonstrated in dozens of species, from birds to spotted hyenas, sometimes using tests originally devised to measure personality traits in humans. Researchers at the Weizmann Institute and the Max Planck Institute have developed an algorithm based on the five-factor model, derived from the famous Myers-Briggs test, to sort mice into the same 5 types of personality as humans: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. The scientists concluded that each mouse could be seen to have a unique, individual personality that consistently informed its behavior. The original 5-factor model was based on the assumption that the fundamental traits of human personality have, over time, become encoded in language. The fact that this same model has now been successfully adapted to identify personality types in other species confirms that personality is prelinguistic in nature. Personality tests, though, offer only a crude measure of individuation. Anyone who has lived with cats or dogs knows that each exhibits unique likes and dislikes, aptitudes, temperaments, relationships, eccentricities, and so on, just as we do. When psychologist and ethologist Barbara Smuts first began conducting field research on a troop of more than 100 baboons, she initially tried to pass herself off to the baboons as nothing more than a detached observer, a neutral object. But the baboons knew better, treating Smuts herself as a social subject vulnerable to the demands and rewards of relationship. Smuts realized that if she was to get the data she needed, she would have to relate to the baboons on their terms, as an equal. Eventually, after weeks living alongside the baboons, Smuts was accepted within the baboons' community. She in turn came to recognize each baboon as a unique individual. Every baboon had a characteristic voice and unique things to say with it. Each had a face like no other, favorite foods, favorite friends, favorite bad habits. A baboon Smuts called Lysistrata, for example, liked to sneak up on an infant riding on its mother's back, knock it off gently, and then pretend to be deeply preoccupied with eating some grass when mom turned to see the cause of the infant's distress. The experience changed the way Smuts saw other beings. Today, when she gazes into the eyes of an animal, Smuts sees someone home, a someone so like ourselves in their essence that we can co-create a shared reality as equals. My friend Corinne Davis, the founder of United Poultry Concerns, a nonprofit advocating on behalf of chickens and turkeys exploited for food, once drove from Virginia to Maryland to rescue severely traumatized and injured hens raised in crowded battery cages so small that they had been unable to extend a single wing. After retrieving the birds, who were exhibiting shock, Corinne didn't have the heart to put them in crates for the return journey, so she let them sit together on the back seat instead. As she drove, she spoke calmly and soothingly to the birds, and eventually they quieted down and began looking around them in curiosity. Then, an astonishing thing happened, Karen recounted. The most naked and pitiful-looking hen began making her way slowly from the back seat, across the passenger seat separator, toward me. She crawled onto my knee and settled herself in my lap for the remainder of the trip. No one, not even Karen, who worked closely with chickens for decades, could have predicted that this particular hen, who had previously known only violence and degradation in her short life, never a single kindness, would have sought out Karen's embrace as she did. Consciousness, in sum, is an open rather than closed phenomenon. It is always its own type. Neither energy nor matter, it cannot be reduced to the physical processes that somehow give rise to it. It is not a thing. However much we attempt to contain the animal within an abstract scientific schema of behaviors, it forever eludes categorization and prediction. The map is never the territory. A word on animal ethics. I have suggested that consciousness ought to be seen as the necessary and sufficient condition of personhood, as the ontological property that gives sentient beings their transcendent value. Any animal who exhibits the quality of singularity of consciousness ought therefore to be held worthy of our respect. My ethical position coincides with that of Donaldson and Kimlicka, who maintain that whenever we encounter someone home, a vulnerable self, we ought to respect that being's bodily and psychic integrity. A someone-centered ethics of this kind, grounded in empathy and in practices of care and compassion, seems to me far superior to utilitarianism, which tends to view persons only as fungible vessels of pain and pleasure. Because utilitarians cannot muster an unqualified respect for vulnerable selves, they hold that the rights of the individual can, or even should be waived when doing so, is likely to maximize the greater happiness of all those potentially affected by our actions. This makes it hard for utilitarians to say just why killing persons is wrong. Hence Peter Singer's callous views on euthanizing disabled human infants, and his qualified support of humane animal agriculture, provided he says that we rear animals in ways that give them good lives and don't cause them to suffer when they are killed. Singer says he gives a pass to conscientious omnivores. As we have seen, Singer's view that causing suffering to animals is worse than violently ending their lives is now also the go-to argument for Michael Pollan, Temple Grandin, and other leading apologists for the animal system, all of whom maintain that animals can be killed without causing harm to their interests. It is clear, however, that any system that treats the lives of sensitive and emotionally complex beings as disposable will inevitably also cause them great suffering in the end. Once the decision to kill has been made, everything else will be permitted. The utilitarian position is therefore self-defeating. I have a great deal of respect for Peter Singer and for his past work in animal advocacy. It was reading Animal Liberation in college, in fact, that convinced me to become a vegetarian, setting me on the path that has led to the book you now hold in your hands. However, I am not alone among animal advocates today in thinking that Singer's theoretical approach has become an impediment to animal justice. In her book Justice for Animals, philosopher Martha Nussbaum offers an alternative theory of animal rights, arguing that sentient beings have a right to flourish within the range of their natural capacities, as individuals and collectivities. It is therefore wrong, she holds, not only to cause animals to suffer, but to thwart the development of their potentialities. While Nussbaum's position is more ethologically informed than Singer's, and hence more attuned to animals' psychological and social needs, she nevertheless agrees with Singer that some animals are not harmed by a painless death in the midst of a thriving life. Into this latter category Nussbaum has placed all fish. Though she acknowledges that fish feel pain, are intelligent, have emotions, experience a rich social life, and even may live complicated and fascinating lives, Nussbaum denies that killing them harms them. supposedly because they lack temporally extended projects. Even if fish could be shown to lack a temporal self, however, Nussbaum has not satisfactorily explained why the lack of a temporally extended project should render a being's life worthless or disposable. Many humans, too, including those suffering from dementia or afflicted with a terminal illness, lack complex temporally extended projects, yet we don't slaughter or test pharmaceuticals on them. Furthermore, there is no good reason to suppose that fish in fact do live in a perpetual present. Since some fish have been shown to have very good memories and to possess the ability to anticipate future events, wouldn't it be wiser to grant all fish the benefit of the doubt? Nussbaum instead errs in the opposite direction. Like other enlightened omnivores, she clings to the baseless hope that fish can be killed in the billions humanely and painlessly. With similar unwarranted credulity, Nussbaum supports well-designed zoos and marine parks and the humane commercial exploitation of sheep for wool, notwithstanding, say, well-publicized undercover videos documenting workers viciously brutalizing sheep in the wool industries of Australia and the UK. Surely a theory of animal justice that makes such ample room for indiscriminate killing of trillions of marine animals, and for the forced confinement, exploitation, and degradation of animals for human entertainment, remains woefully incomplete. What is strikingly absent in both Singer's and Nussbaum's accounts of our relations with animals is any meaningful conception either of freedom or dignity. Freedom, however, is one of the constitutive elements of consciousness, a preference exhibited by all sentient organisms. To deprive an orca, penguin, lion, or shark of their freedom is therefore to show lack of respect for their autonomy. To treat such beings as spectacles of entertainment, as objects for the human gaze, is meanwhile to violate their integrity and dignity as persons or someones. Implicitly, Singer and Nussbaum assert a version of what I have elsewhere termed human species right, or the right of every human to make violent use of every non-human. Rather than mount an explicit defense of such a right, however, the authors merely presume it. This fatally weakens the integrity of their respective projects, since rights are meaningless unless they serve as an inviolable protective cordon around vulnerable selves. It is because animals lack such a protective cordon that, while many U.S. states have statutes against the abuse or torture of animals, they exempt commercially exploited animals, i.e., the vast majority of all animals. In the absence of federal laws prohibiting exploitation of all other species for food, entertainment, hunting, science, and other purposes, animals will continue to suffer and die in unfathomably cruel ways. Alas, the courts will resist granting personhood or someonehood to other beings so long as we continue to take an interest in exploiting them as commodities, and as long as we presume the natural right to do whatever we like to them. Skeptics of animal rights warn that if we grant personhood or the principle of inviolability to members of other species, we'll end up on a slippery slope. Where do we draw the line? Is killing a mosquito to be held equivalent to murder? It is necessary, first, to distinguish between moral injunctions and legal rights. It may be impractical to grant insects the same legal protections as humans, but we could certainly grant them serious moral consideration, following the least harm principle whenever we encounter even such a small, vulnerable self. We may be justified to kill a mosquito on our child's arm, but it would be better to apply DEET, which discourages mosquitoes rather than killing them, and to avoid swampy areas with high mosquito counts. Meanwhile, we can and should seek the prohibition of all insecticides, which are killing trillions of endangered arthropods and poisoning all life on Earth. There will occasionally be hard cases where human and non-human interests genuinely clash, as when locusts descend on a poor farmer's crops, or when bed bugs invade our bedchamber. In such instances, a principle of self-defense may reasonably apply, assuming, however, that all nonviolent means to remedy or prevent the situation have genuinely been exhausted. But the right to self-defense cannot plausibly be extended to justify animal agriculture, fishing, zoos, animal experimentation, or other exploitative practices. Nor can legitimate concern for endangered ecosystems trump respect for the sentient inhabitants who dwell within them. Environmentalists are quick to consign members of invasive species to their deaths, but slow to challenge the economic forces that lead to the introduction of those species in the first place. No invasive species is as harmful as our own, but I have yet to hear Sierra Club or Greenpeace advocating the mass slaughter of real estate developers or the CEOs of oil companies. Wildlife officials must stop resorting to violence against animals as the first, rather than last, resort when coping with ecological disruptions created by our own failed institutions and bad choices. So which moral theory is best for navigating our relations with our fellow beings? I have taken a pluralistic approach to ethics in this work, drawing insights from a variety of methods and traditions, including feminist care ethics, the phenomenology of empathy, post-Kantian deontology, Buddhist principles of ahimsa, Jewish existentialist ethics, and the philosophy of love. Yet after teaching moral philosophy to college students for 25 years, I have come to suspect that simply doing unto others as we would have them do unto us may be nearly as sound a moral principle as any. The golden rule may lack the sophistication of Kant's categorical imperative or the solidity of Bentham's hedonic calculus, but by inviting us to imagine our way into the shoes, or wings, fins, or hooves of other embodied beings, it has the advantage of shattering our habitual egoism. I may never know exactly what it is like to be a cow, a fish, or a lobster, but I can imagine what it would be like to be branded with a red-hot iron, or to suffocate slowly on the deck of a trawler, or to be plunged alive into boiling water. And since I would find all of these things to be terrible if they happened to me, I can intuit why they would also be terrible to happen to my neighbor, to a stranger in a foreign land, or to a someone from another species. Exercising our empathetic imaginations, we can learn to recognize and respond to the interests and needs of other beings, other someones. The vulnerability of the other cries out to us for creaturely solidarity and redress. We have only to listen. Two ways of looking at a blackbird. In the winter of 1878, a child was born to a Jewish family named Buber in the city of Vienna. At the age of 3, following his parents' divorce, the child, named Martin, was sent to live on his paternal grandfather's country estate in Lemberg, what is today Lviv in Ukraine. With its orderly tree-lined streets and stately buildings, the old city might have been mistaken for a city in Austria. A number of Austrians had indeed migrated there in recent decades, lending the city a Viennese air. Yet Lemberg was also a thriving center of Polish and Jewish culture, and the boy's grandfather, a bank auditor, was a distinguished Talmudic scholar. As the boy grew, his grandfather tutored him in the Torah and Jewish lore, just as his own father had done before him. The child's greatest spiritual lesson, however, would be learned not in his grandfather's study, but in his stables. From a chance encounter with a horse on his grandfather's estate, the child, grown into a man, would later develop one of the most profound spiritual insights of the 20th century. Of all the animals on the estate, the one who most held the young boy's fancy was a majestic dappled gray horse, and the boy would sometimes quietly slip into the horse's stall to brush him. One day, as he stood gently stroking the horse's great flanks, the boy looked up and saw to his amazement that the horse was looking at him, too. For a moment, the two gazed into each other's eyes, and a connection welled up suddenly between them. The horse, Buber later wrote, had let me approach, confided itself to me. Boy and horse became bound up with one another in a communion of being more direct and honest than words. A moment later, however, as the boy became aware of his own hand brushing the horse's body, the horse turned away, sensing the boy's shift in attention. The moment of connection between them vanished. Brief though it had been, however, The encounter left a tremendous impression on the young boy. In that moment, he had realized that the world was more than a mere collection of things. Existence had revealed itself to him instead as a community of singular beings, each with its own mysterious integrity. It was this insight that Martin Buber, the child in the story, would eventually make the basis of his 1923 book, I and Thou. In the original German, Ich und Du, I and Thou remains one of the most important works in religious philosophy, a moving treatment of the human condition and of the nature of love. Though chiefly concerned with the relationship between humans and other humans, as an expression of our relation with God, the book also examines our spiritual relations with other animals. The two opposite modes I have outlined in this book vis-a-vis our treatment of animals, as subjects of our love, one moment, and as objects to be exploited or destroyed, the next, can broadly be seen to correspond to Buber's own distinction between two existential states, the I-thou and I-it. The two modes of address represent not merely different ways of approaching other animals, but two different ways of being human. With apologies to poet Wallace Stevens, there are but two ways of looking at a blackbird, and the one we choose defines us as surely as it defines the blackbird. Which is the better way to live a human life? I and thou. Drawing on the mystical Jewish tradition of Hasidism, whose adherents seek a direct, ecstatic experience of the divine, Buber held God to be a living presence in the world, one we might encounter in addressing others as thous. The English word thou, the cognative du in German or tu in French, is an archaic form of you, signifying an intimate, familiar form of address. To approach another being as a thou is to relate to them with our whole being, without preconceptions or any desire to control them. When in this mode of address, we allow the other to rise up before us not merely as a thing among other things, but as a being unlike all others whose exclusiveness resists our every attempt at categorization or reduction. While Buber believed that we can address even trees and other plants as thous, only with other humans and non-human animals did he believe we could enter into a two-sided or reciprocal relation. While other animals may not have words, they nonetheless speak to us with their being. An animal's eyes have the power to speak a great language, Buber writes. In a passage about his cat, Buber reflects, "Sometimes I look into a cat's eyes. The beginning of this cat's glance, lighting up under the touch of my glance, indisputably questioned me. It is possible that you think of me. Do you really not just want me to have fun? Do I concern you? Do I exist in your sight? Do I really exist? What is it that comes from you? What is it that surrounds me? What is it that comes to me? What is it?" While this moment between Buber and his cat lasts the rest of the world, the banal realm of facts and practical matters slips away. The world of it surrounded the animal and myself, Buber writes, while for the space of a glance the world of thou had shone out from the depths. Just as in his childhood encounter with his grandfather's horse, however, the connection is lost, and the world rushes in again. Human and cat are thrust once more back into the realm of ordinary experience. But something meaningful has occurred. They have encountered one another. It is not possible to dwell forever in the pure moment of the I-thou, because we also live in the realm of practical necessity. Much of the time, going about our daily affairs, we must treat the world and others in it as our objects, the mode of relation Buber terms the I-it. Strictly speaking, the I-it mode isn't really a way of relating at all. When I address the other as a thou, I do so with my whole being, but when I address the other as a mere it, I do so only with a narrow part of myself, the grasping, desiring, controlling part of my ego. I open a door, I order lunch, I investigate a plant cell with a microscope, etc. My eye is always doing, assessing, measuring, judging, controlling. Though relating to the world as an it is inevitable, it is not the only mode available to us. And of the two modes of address, only the I-thou relation affords spiritual and ethical truth. While Buber saw the I-thou relation as an experience of God, We needn't subscribe to his theology to appreciate the profound implications of these two modes of human existence. In approaching the other as a thou, we see the other as they are, rather than as we merely imagine them to be. Meanwhile, in opening ourselves to the fullness of the being of the other, we achieve a deeper connection to ourselves, too. In its most complete sense, the I-thou is a form of love. The one who takes his stand in love, Buber writes, ceases to see others remotely as mere its or dots, to borrow my language from a previous chapter. Love is bound up always with the exclusiveness of the other whom we love, with the particular person. In loving this other, we seek only what is best for them, rather than for ourselves. Love, Buber writes, is responsibility of an I for a thou. Love gives meaning to our existence, providing the ground for all true knowing and being. Every living being has limitless value, participating in the infinite, yet it is only in the relation of love that we can perceive that value. Ordinarily, we think of human consciousness alone as having absolute value, but there is irreducible value, too, in the singularity of every consciousness or vulnerable self. A skeptic might ask whether this value is real or simply imagined. There is in fact an old debate in philosophy about whether we hold something to be worth loving because we love it, or whether we love it because it is worth loving in itself. Aristotle's view, which I find persuasive, is that one can't love just anything, but only what's lovable. Genuine love of another, that is, isn't merely a conceit on our part, something we project onto the object of our love, but a way of valuing something worth valuing. I love thee and thou art so lovely and so wonderful and so beautiful, and it does such things to be with thee, murmurs Robert Jordan, the American protagonist of Ernest Hemingway's novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, to a Spanish woman named Maria after they first make love. Hemingway uses the archaic thou and thee to evoke the purity and exclusivity of his lover's spiritual and sexual union. When we gaze into the eyes of our lover, the rest of the world slips away into an infinite distance. We find ourselves in a kind of bubble universe in which only we and our beloved exist. Not you and me, but I and thou uttered as one. I do not lose myself in the other person, yet here there is also no separation, as I and the other become bound up in a moment of communion. When we approach the other, in openness and empathy, we open ourselves to the singularity of the other. Only in feeling and in love, wrote the philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, does this, as in this person or this object, that is, the particular, have absolute value. Like empathy, love is not merely a feeling but a way of knowing. Love gives us our transcendent object, so to say, enabling us to see qualities in our beloved that would otherwise remain hidden from us. Only a loving parent sees the child as he or she is. The child remains a mystery, retaining a depth of being that always remains elusive and partially obscure. Yet through their love, the parent alone apprehends the child's singularity. And in that greatest of tragedies, the death of a child, the parent alone knows what has been lost, a value beyond all measure. As the scholar Arne Vedelson observes, what I find lovable in my beloved is his or her uniqueness, the qualities, revealed in my love, that render my beloved irreplaceable and unexchangeable. This insight illuminates the love that we are capable of experiencing in our relations with members of other species, too. Only in relating to the animal other as a unique thou, in a relation of mutual trust and vulnerability, is this particular being's irreplaceable and unexchangeable nature revealed to us. And through that relation, we discover a richer sense of our own existential and spiritual possibilities. There is no other proof of being but love. To illustrate these concepts, and following in the vein of Martin Buber's description of his cat, I want to offer some brief reflections on my own experiences with companion animals. My sisters and I grew up alongside a succession of adopted strays and shelter rescues, whom we and our parents treated as members of our family. This is not to say that we mistook our companions for humans. While their life worlds overlapped with ours, It was clear that they also inhabited different realms of experience. They saw and heard things we couldn't see or hear, smelled things we couldn't smell. When they slept, they moved their limbs and uttered suppressed cries. But what phantoms they chased in their dreams, we could not fathom. Despite our different evolutionary histories, we were nonetheless able to share a pleasant life together. Our companions sought out our affection and company as often as we sought out theirs. When they were unwell, we brought them to a doctor to be treated. And when we ourselves were laid up in bed, our companions would come lie with us. Our cats and dogs were able to interpret many of our moods and intentions, just as we were able to interpret many of theirs. If one of the cats wanted to go outside, she or he would stand by the door and give us a significant look. Each animal was unique, with quirks, preferences, and habits of their own. Tiki, our Siamese cat, had the habit of leaping up onto my father's shoulders as he sat at the kitchen table. The two would sit together like that for some time, my father eating or reading the newspaper, Tiki with his body draped around my father's neck, his legs dangling down, each silently enjoying the company of the other. There were times when our behavior must have seemed baffling or irrational to our companions, as when we let them outdoors at some times but not others, or suddenly shooed them off the living room sofa, or boarded them in the dreaded kennel when we went on vacation, a trauma to them. By the same token, their behavior could be perplexing and exasperating to us, as well. Our cat Tiki had one vexing habit that deprived me of many a good night's sleep. Before we would all head to bed each night, we would go to the door and call Tiki, and most times he would dutifully come rushing in. Sometimes, though, if he was engrossed in his carousings, he would pretend not to hear us, even though we could plainly see him stalking through the underbrush of the backyard, not 10 yards away. Eventually, we would give up and go to bed. Later, in the middle of the night, Tiki would scale a tall fence and leap up onto the roof, showing up outside my second-floor bedroom window to be let in again, crying and noisily dragging his claws across the screen, until I opened the window and let him in, along with mosquitoes in summer and cold air in winter. Much as I tried to discourage Tiki from this practice, even spraying him with a water bottle, he persisted, evidently having concluded that his late-night liberties were worth the indignities he suffered getting back inside again. I hadn't trained Tiki to climb up onto the roof and awaken me. He had trained me to let him in. Later, when I lived with cats as an adult, I began to peer more deeply into the lives and experiences of my companions. After completing graduate school, my partner M and I moved to Oak Park, Illinois, where we decided to adopt 2 cats from the local shelter, a long-haired orange and white tabby with an elfin face, whom we named Alfie, and a long-haired black cat with bright eyes, whom we named Sasha. A video of our cats can be found on my author's website. Once installed in their new home, they proved inseparable. There was no nook or cranny of our apartment they didn't explore, and within weeks of their arrival they had together discovered a hidden crawl space in the ceiling above our bathtub, one we had not known about, which they accessed by leaping onto the top shelf of the bathroom linen closet and scaling an interior retaining wall. It is the quotidian rather than the extraordinary that makes up the substance of our lives, and this was true of the 4 of us, a family of interspecies intimates whose shared habits formed the ground of a domestic existence. When we brushed our teeth before bed, the cats would come into the bathroom to watch. Alfie made a nightly game of leaping up and pulling the string of the bathroom light, turning it on and off, each time crashing down into the wicker wastebasket. At bedtime, the cats would join us in bed, Alfie settling on my chest and Sasha on M's. If Sasha made it onto the bed first, Alfie would become jealous, walking by the bed with feigned disinterest and ignoring our invitations to join us. Eventually, he would leap up and settle on my chest, pressing his face against mine. However, if I became so absorbed in reading a book that I began to pet Alfie in a distracted way, he would at once register my loss of attention and leap testily off the bed, digging me just enough with his claws, which he normally kept carefully retracted, to signal his displeasure. though we had planned to keep the cats indoors. A furnace malfunction one hot summer night forced us to evacuate the building and release the cats into the cool evening air. At once, powerful, febrile senses honed over the course of millions of years suddenly went online for the first time. Alfie and Sasha drank in the natural world in huge sensorial gulps, attentive to every scent and sound in the expanse of yards and gardens and streets. The world suddenly revealed itself to them in its full, intoxicating splendor. From then on, they became indoor-outdoor cats, coming and going into the late evening, each new day offering fresh opportunities for adventure and exploration. With the exuberance and curiosity of all youth, they plunged through lush hedges, explored the secret tunnels of groundhogs, and frolicked for hours in the violent thunderstorms and blizzards of the Midwest. Turning up together at the front door soaked to the skin and covered in mud, they would saunter in with bright eyes, then head with nonchalance to their water and food bowls. Then they would make up their toilet for half an hour before throwing down somewhere to dry off. Despite their great affinity for one another, there was a period when friction appeared in their relationship. Sometimes, Alfie would hide in our bedroom closet behind the floor-length curtain strung across the opening as a door, positioning himself just out of sight. There he would patiently lie and wait, sometimes for half an hour or more, hoping to catch Sasha unawares on his way to the bedroom window-sill, where he liked to sit and gaze out onto the street. If Sasha didn't show, Alfie would eventually leave his hunters blind and go looking for something else to do. Often enough, though, Sasha would fall into Alfie's ambush. If Sasha wasn't sure where Alfie was, he would walk past the closet slowly and cautiously, with his ears back and his head turned in the direction of a potential attack. Alfie would explode through the curtain just the same, hurling himself upon Sasha with sudden violence. Though it was mischievous fun for Alfie, it was plain from the desperate panic in Sasha's eyes that he hated it. Around this time, too, Alfie took to chasing and tackling his friend even after Sasha had lost interest in their game. Alfie's attacks and rough play soon became a dark spot in what had previously been the cloudless sky of Sasha's existence. Once a place of safety, our apartment had become a place of anxiety and fear. I cannot prove, but have little doubt, that some version of these dark episodes haunted Sasha's dreams as he slept. Finally, after weeks of enduring this abuse, Sasha had had enough. A morning came when he simply refused to have anything to do with Alfie at all. When Alfie approached him to play, Sasha would hiss at him and stalk away with an ugly look, ears folded back. Baffled by his friend's new behavior, Alfie would sit on his haunches with a comically quizzical expression, tilting his head from side to side as if trying to make sense of Sasha's behavior. Ethologists have shown that other animals have a sense of fair play just as we do, negotiating their personal boundaries and rules of interactions with others. So it proved now. Sasha's refusal to engage with Alfie went on for days, and it was painful to watch. Eventually, after days of getting the silent treatment from his companion, Alfie finally got the message. He became mindful of his claws and teeth during the cat's rough housing, and he put an end to his ambush game, mostly. When Sasha grew tired of being chased, Alfie would now tactfully step away. The two cats again became inseparable comrades, and harmony was restored to our household. This is but one story of many I might relate concerning our shared lives together. No account I might offer of Sasha and Alfie's experiences, however, could fully capture the complexity of their personalities, nor exhaust the meaning of their lives. Our cats remained emissaries from a world alien to our own. Yet notwithstanding the differences between our species, perhaps, indeed, because of them, we shared a rich and meaningful existence together, and we developed deep emotional bonds. And when those bonds were finally, ineluctably, sundered, we were left bereft. Not long after the events I have described, Em and I moved with our infant son to Boston. A few weeks afterwards, Alfie disappeared, and our frantic efforts to recover him proved fruitless. One morning not long after Alfie went missing, I arrived at my office after my hour-long commute to find an anguished phone message from my partner, telling me that Sasha had been killed by a car. I canceled my classes and got back on the road, crying most of the way. When I arrived home again, I found my partner with our 2-year-old son huddled on the living room floor over Sasha's still warm body. We later learned that a woman had struck Sasha down with an SUV in front of our house, then pulled over to see if he had survived. Finding him dead, the woman had wrapped his ruined body in a baby blanket from her car, then placed him on the sidewalk. It was there that my partner had found him, his eyes open but unseeing. Alfie's disappearance and Sasha's death threw us into a grief as profound as any I had known before or have known since. The twin losses undid the invisible rituals woven into our existence, and our world seemed to tilt off its axis, making the familiar suddenly unfamiliar. The cats had filled our lives with relationality and wonder. Now a desolation filled our home. Turning a corner in our apartment, we would expect to encounter one of the cats, only to find our senses grasping at emptiness. Alfie and Sasha's absence had become a palpable presence. The mystical Kabbalistic tradition tells us that every intentional action we take in a loving way can be the fulfillment of a mitzvah, or command from God. In this connection, even our everyday relations with our beloved animals, though ostensibly unfolding mostly in the realm of the I-it, had been suffused with love. As Lindgren Johnson notes, it is indeed the repeated awakenings and openings of attention and mutuality that constitute the ground of love, raising the otherwise banal realm of I-it into the transcendent realm of I-thou. Though some philosophers argue that other animals lack a narrative life, through time, the lives of our animal companions unquestionably had a narrative and biographical structure. And had our cats been living in freedom, as feral cats outside a human domicile, their experiences would have been no less existentially significant, though their lives had gone unwitnessed by human eyes and unregistered by any human heart. Due to our species' narcissism, we have come to think of our cats and dogs as somehow special, as having qualities that set them apart from other species. But the same qualities that make our companion animals worthy of our love are to be found in other sentient beings. We know this partly because humans have also forged deep, enduring bonds of affection with members of dozens if not hundreds of other species, including horses, sheep, turkeys, pigs, mongooses, magpies, rhinos, elephants, otters, minas, parrots, wolves, orcas, bears, dolphins, fish, and even, in the remarkable case of Costa Rican fisherman Gilberto Shedden's 20-year friendship with Pacho, with a 1,000-pound wild crocodile. Such friendships confirm the value to be found in every consciousness approached as a thou. In Animal Liberation, Peter Singer makes a show of the fact that he does not himself love animals. His sole concern as a utilitarian, he says, is to maximize the overall happiness of sentient beings, while reducing their overall unhappiness. However, we must ask what it can mean to seek the happiness of others without also finding them to be worth valuing in themselves, as being deserving of our loving concern. If I do not care about you, why should I care about what happens to you? The utilitarian way of formulating ethics, it seems to me, seriously misconstrues the meaning, purposes, and possibilities of human life. Surely a tradition that so openly scorns empathy and love cannot hope to summon within itself, or in us, the powerful resources needed to confront the evils of our time. Nor can such a tradition, which admits no pride of place for empathy or love in our theories of moral life, offer a plausible account of the spiritual dimensions of our condition that make life worth living, by which I mean a sense of ethical and existential purpose, grounded in loving connection with others. Because utilitarians fail to recognize love as a paramount value, they are helpless before the existential problem of death, which they tend to view in quantitative terms, i.e., purely as the realization or frustration of aggregate pains or pleasures over a lifetime. No one, though, who has cradled a dying animal or infant can fail to grasp the profundity of death, nor be insensible to the irrevocable harm it confers. It is in our very finitude that our own lives are rendered precious, and it is the vulnerability of those we love, their susceptibility to death, which renders us vulnerable to grief. And in that grief alone do we find confirmation of the limitless value of what we have lost. The bell tolls for thee. A life lived only in the mode of the I-it, Buber held, is so impoverished as to be a life not worth living. The individual unable to enter into authentic relations with others is to be pitied, he wrote. Even worse, though, is the one who mouths the words, I-thou, cynically, out of a desire to manipulate, control, or destroy others. Buber described such persons as contemptible. Those today who, though claiming to love and respect animals, seek out opportunities to exploit and inflict violence upon them, must be placed in this latter category. What the hunter or locavore mistakes for respect, or even love of the animal he victimizes, is malignant narcissism. When we reduce other animals to mere objects of our use, we encounter them only in their thing-like dimensions, obstructing our view of their true natures. We thereby lose the opportunity for the deeper communion with others, both human and non-human, that constitutes our highest good. Buber conceived of the I-thou relation as an opening out onto a wider world of universal compassion. The one who honors the thou can be effective, helping, healing, educating, raising up, saving. In the responsibility that I take for the other lies the likeness of all who love, from the smallest to the greatest. It was essentially this injunction, Buber noted, that Christ made the centerpiece of his teaching, love of all humanity. We do not need to enter into a personal, I-thou, relation with every other in order to grasp the singular value of each. As feminist peace activist Barbara Deming observed, though it isn't possible for us to love every person individually, what is possible is to act toward another human being on the assumption that all human lives are of value, that there is something about any individual to be loved, whether one can feel love for that specific person or not. This same insight can be applied to our relations with other natural beings. I do not need to personally encounter every individual chicken, whale, or minnow to recognize their finitude and vulnerability, and hence to regard each as worthy of my respect as a thou. Love indeed fails to obtain its universal, transcendent character so long as it remains parochial or private. Only in responding in solidarity and mutual aid to the needs of others even distant from ourselves is an authentic moral life possible. As John Donne wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." Today, love for our fellow human beings can seem in such vanishingly short supply that it may seem counterintuitive, or simply quixotic, to urge that we extend our solidarity to other species as well. With each passing day, however, our own survival more and more depends on our learning to address all creatures of the earth, too, from the smallest to the greatest, as thou. The freed Roman slave Terence famously remarked that nothing human could be alien to him. In affirming our common existential condition with other beings, we might at last come to recognize that nothing animal is wholly alien to us, either. Our species is not an island entire of itself, but a part of the biotic main, a piece of the continent. And should a deer perish in a forest fire, a shark die on the deck of a ship, or a bird die of the flu, that death diminishes me too.